Te presentamos a Peter Kelly. Peter Kelly tiene una licenciatura en Filosofía y Lenguaje y una maestría en Filosofía por la Universidad de York, Inglaterra. Tiene estudios, diplomas y certificados en Lingüística Aplicada y Educación por el British Council, el Instituto Anglo-Mexicano de Cultura, el Centro Universitario Villanueva y la Universidad de Carolina del Norte. Actualmente, él es consultor académico para escuelas y universidades en México y un formador de profesores a nivel nacional. Tiene más de 35 años de experiencia como profesor en primaria, secundaria, bachillerato y universidad, enseñando literatura inglesa, historia, escritura creativa, inglés como lengua extranjera, filosofía, teoría del conocimiento y pensamiento crítico y creativo. Ha impartido conferencias, cursos y talleres sobre temas como lingüística, formación de profesores, enseñanza del inglés como lengua extranjera, programas de desarrollo profesional, entre otros. Es autor y coautor de 7 libros de texto de enseñanza del idioma inglés para escuelas secundarias y editor del programa Self-English de Grupo Educare. Démosle la bienvenida a Peter Kelly.
Welcome to our webinar today, in which we will be focusing on the very important concept of incorrect language production, ILP. But first a question. Do you like cooking? Because I know I don't. Beyond the occasional omelette and cereal, I'm not a good cook at all. One of the characteristics of my poor cooking is that I sometimes confuse the ingredients. A while ago, I was making an omelette and I confused the salt with the sugar. I put too much salt. I didn't put enough sugar. Yes, I like sweet omelettes. Now, did I make a mistake? Or was that an error? Or was it a slip or a lapse? A mistake, an error, or a slip? I don't think it matters in that context. We can call it any of those three. I made a mistake, I made an error, or I slipped up, or I made a slip or a lapse. The reason why I don't think it matters in that context is because what is really focused on is the result. The omelette was not of the correct flavor. The process wasn't really focused on. We don't need to focus on the process in that particular case. That's why they can be synonyms in that context. But I think in our business, the causes, the processes involved in producing incorrect language are important. And I think, therefore, the differentiation between errors, mistakes, and lapses is a useful one. And I think for that reason, we respect the terminology in our business. Okay, now, what can go wrong? What can the incorrect language be or consist of? First, the obvious thing is the construction of sentences. Sentences require a certain structure, a certain syntactical procedure to produce them correctly, subject, predicator, etc. Things can go wrong here, especially in the area of syntax, given that our students who speak Spanish or Latin late languages do not follow the same syntactic patterns as we do in English. The articulation of the sounds. We're talking about the productive skills. We make mistakes and errors when we're producing English. We're talking about the writing and the speaking skill. In this case, the articulation of the sounds at the phonemic level or stress and intonational levels can go wrong. The choice of word, both in the written or the spoken production, that can be a problem too. The choice of tense is an obvious area of serious confusion amongst some students, especially given the complications of present perfect or the future reference forms. they can make mistakes or errors or lapses in the choice of tense. Spelling, obviously, that can cause serious confusion if it's not done well in the written skill, punctuation as well, even more so punctuation, I think. And in both, but especially in the written forms, coherence is an area that students can find challenging, and when they're tempted to produce written text, for example, as we saw before, coherence can be a problem. So, considering the ideas I mentioned at the beginning, the classification, let's look at these three in more detail. Incorrect language produced can be classified as either errors or mistakes or lapses. A piece of incorrect language cannot be two or three of those. It has to be one at the exclusion of the others. Let's look at these in a bit more detail. Errors. First thing to notice is the cause of errors, the main cause, if not the only cause really, is ignorance. The student does not know the correct form, be it a syntactic issue, be it the correct word, be it a tense, whatever. They do not know the correct form. And why do they not know? Well, there are two or three possibilities. One is they have never been exposed to that particular language point. They've never studied it. They've never been taught it. On the other hand, maybe they have been taught it and exposed to it, but in such a way as to be ineffective. The teaching, let's say, was not adequate enough to help the student understand. It's not a question of it's the beginning of the process of learning. It just was such a bad class, let's say, that it didn't work at all, and the student did not understand at all. Some of the characteristics we can mention are that with errors, self-correction is not possible. Because the student does not know the correct form, it's not really worth it to try and help the student or get the student to self-correct. They can't. They might get it right by accident, say, but true self-correction is only when the student realizes she's wrong and knows the correct form and thus corrects. When the student gets it right by chance, that's not really self-correction because they didn't know why it was wrong in the first place and they don't know why it is right in the second place. So, with an error, self-correction is not possible, which tells us that we have to be very sure of what they should and shouldn't know at any given level. Because if we try to get self-correction to occur when it is an error, it won't work, and we're pressuring the student unnecessarily. Another characteristic is that errors are consistently wrong. When they try to use the same language point, which they don't know, they will get it wrong nearly always. And if they get it right, repeat, it's probably by accident. So here are three aspects of errors which are very important for us in terms of what we do when students produce these things. The second type is called mistakes. The causes here, in general, are an incomplete language learning process. They have been taught, they have been exposed, and they have begun to understand what the language point is, its structure, its form, and its meaning. But it's not yet complete. That process is incomplete. They're beginning to understand and produce it well, but by no means are they mistake-free. Characteristics of mistakes, because they have been exposed to and have studied and have been taught, and they're beginning to understand, then if they think about it, self-correction is possible. The teacher can here validly ask a student to self-correct, given the correct technique, and it's possible that the student can. It's not an inappropriate thing to ask a student to do if it's a mistake. And consequently, because it's part of the process of learning this language point, they're inconsistently wrong and inconsistently right. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. That is a characteristic of mistakes, not of errors, remember. The third group are slips or lapses, if you prefer. Here, it's a bit different. The causes are generally things like inattentiveness or tiredness. The student is tired or inattentive, and says something that is not correct. But because it's a slip, we have to notice the characteristics. Because here, self-correction is always possible and usually immediate. Once the student knows and realizes they've made this kind of incorrect language production, they will self-correct. Interestingly enough, native speakers, you in your native language, me in mine, we are prone to this type of ILP. We are tired, we're very distracted, and we say the wrong word, we say the wrong tense. But the solution is not more teaching or more learning. We don't need to study our native language anymore to get rid of this. We just have to sort of wake up, focus, pay attention. And because native speakers are prone to this type of ILP, it's not really related to the second language learning process. So it's not something we really have to think about. So from all these three, errors, mistakes, and lapses, errors are something which are solved when the student begins to study and learn the language point. That will come later. Slips are only caused usually by high-level achievers. People who have achieved a high level of English can, when they get tired or inattentive, slip when they produce English. Beginners cannot do this. They're not as familiar with the language as a high advanced or high intermediate level student is. Therefore, they can't get it wrong through tiredness or inattentiveness, really. There's always a mistake or error involved with beginners or low-level intermediate area students. And because they're not really part of the process of learning a second language, given that native speakers do it too, the only area of these three, the only one of these three that really is our sort of business is mistakes. This is the most relevant area for our work as language teachers, helping students with their mistakes. Now, before we go into corrections and things like that, which we will do a little bit later today, we have to think about certain issues involved in the production of incorrect language, both from the student's point of view and from the teacher's point of view. I don't know about you, but I have never come across a teacher who, when her students or his students make a mistake, say, "Yes, another mistake. Thank you, Lord." I've never heard that. Have you? Have you ever congratulated a student for making a mistake? Have you ever felt pleased that a student is making a mistake? Probably not. And they neither. That's the point. They probably do not see the making of mistakes as a positive thing. So this is where we get involved in the attitudinal issues towards this particular aspect of our job. In terms of the students, they can well be concerned about losing face. The mistakes, if it's in a speaking level, they probably are going to make them in public, in the classroom. If it's in writing, obviously it's private with the teacher. But when we talk about the speaking skill and students making mistakes during the speaking act in the classroom, there is a risk that they can feel they're losing face. Combined with that, or as a consequence, they can lose some level of self-confidence. They can lose their sort of self-esteem as a language learner because they're making mistakes. And they see that as a sign of inability. Consequently, an attitude toward learning becomes sort of defensive. They defend themselves against making mistakes. One common way of doing that is to stop speaking. They stop participating in class because they don't want to make mistakes. So they defend themselves from these negative feelings. But being human, they find something or someone to blame. This is a common thing. They blame the teacher, poor teaching. They blame the textbook, it's not clear, it's too dense. The schedule, the classes are too late, or Friday afternoons before 2 o'clock, or around 2 o'clock. They find things to blame, which is a shame. One of the reasons here is that they don't really understand the causes of making mistakes, like we do, like we're studying today. They don't understand that it's a process. They're always focused on the result, what they say, not what's going on inside. They don't understand these processes. They're not aware of them. So they see the surface of this issue. They see the result, the mistake, and they react in various negative ways. What about teachers? What about us? How do we see this? In many cases, and not in all, but in many cases, especially traditionally, incorrect language is seen as a failure of someone or something. And using this rather tired metaphor, but it still is effective, the glass is half empty. They see it as a negative. They don't see the positive behind it, around it. When the students are not making mistakes, the mistake stands out. The glass is half empty. The teachers of this type see accuracy as vital. It's way more important than fluency. Accuracy is what they want. They don't want students to make mistakes. And one of the consequences of that is a serious overload of corrections. They overcorrect a lot. And the assessments, naturally, focus on the mistakes. A student gets a score or an evaluation based on the number of mistakes that occur, not on the number of correct things that occur. So here we have a serious negativity behind these teachers' attitudes. Not all teachers are like this, of course, but I think today, even today, many teachers find mistakes to be little devils that must be excised from the room. They don't see them as something to be happy about, to be content with, to see in the bigger context of the process of learning. Think about it. If a student makes no mistakes at all in your classes, whatever she does, whether she speaks or writes, whatever you're teaching her, she never makes one mistake, something would be wrong. You would think, I hope, that there's something wrong here. At least she's in the wrong level. She should be put in a higher level. And then we have the other end. What about if they always make mistakes? Always. Let's have a look at that a bit later. So, both teachers and students, at least teachers and students, if not other people involved, often see mistakes as a negative thing. My hope today is that we can put them into a bigger context where we can see the value of them. Now, one of the things that helps us understand incorrect language is to identify the main causes of incorrect language. Here, we can see in this fishbone diagram, the incorrect language is produced, in a sense, in 5 ways. There are other things involved, but these are sort of the main 5 ways that this incorrect language is produced. First is through ignorance, as we've seen, and that will cause errors. People who don't know the correct form will, when they try to produce it, make an error. Self-correction is not possible. There's no reason to ask the student to think and self-correct. That won't work. It just pressures the student, embarrasses the student, stresses the student. And if they keep trying to produce that particular item of language that is unknown to them, they will consistently get it wrong. Another cause is L1 interference. I'm sure you're familiar with this. L1 interference is when the student's native language is interfering subconsciously. It's very important. It's subconscious interference with the production of the second language. So in Spanish, we have the example of a student saying, I have 15 years. That is because in the Spanish language, and the Spanish mind, so to speak, age is something you possess. So the verb have is a natural verb to use. You have it in Spanish, but you don't have it in English. You are it. It's the verb to be in English. We are of a certain age. So when a student is responding to the question, how old are you? And she says, I have 15 years. Probably what is happening, because it's so quick and the answer is so sort of naturally produced, she's not really thinking about it. It's probably because her own language and the structures in her mind that have been formed or that are part of her own language are interfering at the moment of production. Another cause is that of translation. This is different to L1 interference. We are involving the L1. The student is translating from her mother tongue to the second language, but it's conscious. That's the big difference. You can see a student do this. They're thinking and there's sort of word-by-word translation going on in their head. It's so interesting. But maybe they've reached the limit of their English, and they're trying to say something, and they can't, but they want to say something in a debate or a discussion. So they fall back on their native language and sort of translate it, hoping that will be understandable. We're going to look at these 5 things later, a bit later, and see the pros and cons of each one, just to sort of give you a sample of that. The translation, if it is the case where the student wants to express themselves in English, not in Spanish, they refuse to say it in Spanish. They say it in English, but they don't have really the command needed, so they fall back on their own language and translate it as well they can. Does that show good spirit or not? The right spirit for language learning or not? Let's have a look at that in a minute. The 4th cause is over-application of the rules. A student doesn't know the rule required for this particular piece of language. They've been taught other rules, and when they come across a new piece of language, they apply what they know and to see if it works. A classic example is when we teach modal auxiliaries after teaching present simple. We teach I study, she studies, etc. Then we begin to introduce the modals like should or must, and suddenly it becomes she must study, not she must studies. And the student may think, well, hang on, you spent a few weeks teaching me third person singular with S on the end in she or it, and now I'm using she with a verb and you tell me I can't do that. Wrong. Okay, yes, it is wrong. You have to learn another rule. That's the process of learning language, acquiring, as much as anything, all these rules slowly. The 5th cause I want to mention today is the under-application of the rules. The student knows the rule quite well, but because it's understandable without using it properly, they tend not to. An example of this would be, do you have milk? It should be, do you have any milk? But because do you have milk is totally understandable, then is it any or some, and that sort of confusing area of English, they prefer not to apply the rule and just go the shortcut. Do you have milk? Okay. Now, I've just given you a sample of how we can think about these things in terms of the pros and cons. So let's look at them in more detail, all of them, and see which ones could be a sign of the right spirit, the right mental attitude needed to study English and be successful, and which ones would we want not to happen because they would be having a negative influence on the process of learning. Ignorance, obviously, we can discard that. Being a cause, the cure is learning it at some point later. So it doesn't matter. It's not part of this discussion. The L1 interference. Now, the L1 interference, what do you think about that? Do we want students to be using their own native language subconsciously, unconsciously, to produce English? What do you think about that? Would that be considered a good thing or not a good thing? I would say it's not the best thing. I would say it's not a thing we should promote or encourage or accept. I think we should help students get out of that. If it becomes a habit, we should help students get out of that, if possible. Now, as I mentioned before, with translation, in some cases, it could be a sign of the right attitude towards learning. I mean, jumping in and trying, see what happens. Yeah, using your own language to support you, but refusing to use your own language, refusing to express your ideas in your own language, and insisting to yourself, I must try in English, and therefore, I don't know how to say it in English, but I will try. I'll look at how we say it in Spanish and I'll translate it. that could be a sign of the correct attitude, the right spirit. But overdone, students consciously translating every grammar point they come across and see how it is in Spanish, comparing it, contrasting it, is not a good idea. There are too many differences, profound differences between the two languages to really help. There are many sort of things that are not really translatable clearly or well. I would suggest that is avoided. Now, the over-application of the rules, what does that tell us? If a student is trying to say something, comes across a new thing to say, using language they're not really sure about, but they have some rules, so why not try and see if the rule works? That, to me, suggests the right spirit, the right way to approach learning a language. You're not afraid of making mistakes. You'll go for it. That is an attitude I personally respect a lot in my students. However, the under-application of the rules is something that I don't really appreciate as a positive at all. That is, to put it sort of colloquially, as laziness. I mean, students are just lazy. They know the rule, but they don't want to apply it because it doesn't really add anything to the meaning. It's just structural. I can understand the dislike for pure structure, but I think we should be avoiding that as much as possible. Okay. Now, let's look at the sort of process itself. Not a clear thing, still not fully understood, of course. Learning languages first or second or third or whatever is still mysterious in many cases, in many ways. But what has been identified is that there is a sort of space between the L1 and the L2 that is called the interlanguage. As you see by this Venn diagram, it's sort of a mixture. It's not purely L1, it's not purely L2, it's something in the middle. In fact, interlanguage is something that all students have, I think, forever. I don't think a student beginning in classes studying English at the beginner's level and after sort of 5 or 6 years of studying comes out at a very high advanced level, I don't think they're ever going to achieve in classes, by studying formally, the level of a native speaker. So the vast majority of our students always have an interlanguage. It's part of what's called their idiolect, We all have idiolects. It's our own personal version of any language we know. It's as unique to each individual as their fingerprint or their eye print. Nobody has the Spanish or Portuguese or French that you have. Nobody has the English that I have. It's not possible. We have different vocabularies. We use the words in different ways, different styles of using the same words, different commands of the grammar, etc., etc. So it's quite unique. So the interlanguage is part of the student's idiolect. They have an idiolect in their own language too, and in the second language they're learning, or third language. The interlanguage is a phenomenon which is full of process. What is going on in the student's mind is process. The student's mind is processing all the input from the classes and trying to make sense of it and accommodate it into what is already known about that language. Now, here we come to sort of more practical issues. How much correction should occur? That's an interesting question. And we're going to look first at the two extremes. No corrections at all, ever, and 100% correction. All the incorrect language is corrected. Doesn't matter by who or how, we're going to look at that from an extreme point of view. What would be the consequence of that? All this is designed to show us how important mistakes are, the value of them. Let's say that we never correct, ever. Students speak and write, and all we do is praise and comment on what they say or what they write. We never indicate any incorrect language, and we never, as a consequence, expect any correction to occur. It's pretty clear that there will be little or no improvement at all. And the biggest risk will be that fossilization would occur. The things they get wrong, because they're not focused on and corrected, would become fossilized, and they would never be able to get rid of them in a future date. It's almost impossible to get rid of fossilized mistakes in high intermediate levels. It's very difficult. A lot of accuracy work is needed, and it takes time, much more time than we normally have. So these two things would probably occur. I think definitely would occur. So never is not a viable way to go. What about always? What about if we always correct every single mistake that occurs in writing or speaking? What would happen there? I would suggest that the students would lose their ability to be fluent, because they would lose self-confidence, because every time they make something or say something that's wrong, the teacher would sort of react and expect a correction. They would lose self-confidence. Imagine every time. Fluency will be severely damaged, accuracy will be the pure focus, and self-confidence would deteriorate considerably in the students. Imagine the frustrations, too, in both teacher and students. So it's not really should we correct or not, because the answer is yes, we should. But the question is now, what should we correct? How, who, and when? Because here we can see the basic premise is that correction is needed. Not 100% of the time, but not never either. So what is the balance? So that comes with the exploration of what should be corrected, especially. But after that, we have to focus on how the correction should occur, who should do them, and when should they be done. So let's look at the first question, what to correct? I think if we focus on these three factors, we won't go far wrong. The gravity, frequency, and consistency of the mistake, remember we're focusing on mistakes here, not errors or lapses, but the gravity, the frequency, and the consistency of the mistake is something we should consider seriously before we decide to correct or not. The more grave or more serious, the more frequent, and the more consistent the mistake would suggest it needs fixing. So I'm suggesting we should respond only to the more serious, the more frequent, and the more consistent incorrect language, more consistent, frequent, and serious mistakes. The ones that are not serious, the ones that are not frequent, and the ones that are not consistent, ignore them. Don't respond to them. Don't ask for corrections. We can't do everything, remember. We can't focus on all the ILP. Now, the gravity. What is more serious? Well, what is more serious is what affects understanding. The more grave or the more serious the mistake, the more misunderstanding can occur in the listener's mind. If what the student is saying or writing is understandable, but there are some mistakes involved, then they're not so serious. That's what grave or serious means here. How much it affects communication. The more frequent, that's obvious, the more consistent, yes. If it's 100% consistent, remember, it's going to be an error, not a mistake. But if it's fairly consistent, they get it wrong quite a lot, and it's quite frequent, I mean, there's a relative number there, and an absolute number too, and it does affect or not affect the understanding of what they're saying or writing, then we should or should not help them through correction. So these three factors, I think, are vital. It's not always easy to decide which is more serious. For example, in the writing process, when the students are writing, which could be more serious or more grave, spelling mistakes or punctuation mistakes? They both occur. I would suggest in some cases the punctuation, if the comma is not used correctly, it can cause serious confusion. In most cases, I don't think spelling causes great confusion. They don't normally spell the word, so it's unintelligible or unrecognizable. It's recognizable, so it doesn't really affect communication. So given those two, I would suggest that we be more attentive about the bad use of commas than of spelling mistakes. So that's the what. This helps us avoid overcorrection, because we're only focusing on the most grave, the most frequent, the most consistent. The others we're not focusing on. And this obviously gives us the chance to help the students with some of the mistakes they make, not none of them. This is a good balance. The how. How do we respond to the incorrect language production? I think many of you have already been exposed to this list of symbols. This list of symbols where we, with an abbreviation, or just the initial letters of the word, we indicate what the mistake is, especially what type of mistake. So if a student uses a wrong word, then we underline the word that is wrong, and next to that, or above it, we put WW, wrong word. Obviously, we teach these symbols to students at the beginning of the semester. They probably have a sheet of paper which they stick in their notebook at the back, where the symbols are clearly indicated with examples, so they understand exactly. Because it's not our job to correct them. Repeat, it's not our job to correct the students. They made the mistakes. They have to correct. But we have to help them. That is our job. We help them here by indicating what type of mistake it is. Whether it's WW, wrong word, SP, spelling, P, punctuation, VT, verb tense, VF, verb form, WO, word order, WF, word form. Now, the VT and VF, one problem is a tense and one problem is the form. If a student writes, my father work in an office, then it is the correct tense, but it's not the correct form. It should be works. It's not a tense problem, it's a form problem. But if a student said, yesterday my father work, then it should be worked. Although something is missing as well, it's not a question of the form so much as the tense is wrong. So with this list, we have to make it bigger because there are other types of mistakes that occur. We can help students very well by indicating what is wrong, but without correcting. We give them the chance to focus and think and correct themselves. Here we come to grading. This is assigning a value to what is produced. Traditionally, we use either numbers, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, etc., or we use letters, A, B, B minus, and B plus, things like that. Here, for example, the most common form is with numbers. But we're giving it a number. We're giving it a value as a consequence. We're telling the student what we think it's worth, what their work is worth, in a qualitative sense. I think it's very important we think about the grade very carefully before we casually assign a value to whatever is produced. One of the most common grades in the whole world is that of 8, the number 8. Many, many teachers assign 8 more than any other number. Given it's a passing grade, 8 is the most common number assigned to written work, especially in many, many areas of the world. Now think about that, 8. I have a suspicion that 8 is the number we give when we don't know what to give. We're not sure. Because a 9 sends a very clear message, very good. And a 7 sends a very different message, needs improvement, but okay. And both of those have different psychological effects in the person who's seeing that grade. Students themselves, parents, coordinators, whomever. But if we give an 8, we're often avoiding trying to send a very positive message, and we're often avoiding trying to send a more negative message. It's a grade that won't cause problems. We won't get too many complaints. But if we put 7s, we might. And if we put 9s, we're sort of sending a message isn't quite right because it doesn't really compare to a work of a 10 that some of my students are also producing. It's too close. So I don't want to send that message. But I don't want to send a negative message that a 7 can send, so I'll just opt for 8 and hope everybody will be comfortable with that. But what about if 8 was prohibited? You couldn't give an 8. You had to give a 7 or a 9 or a 7.5 or an 8.5. Or that would require us to think a little bit more, to think about what we're doing with that value that we are assigning. Because remember, you're the only person who really knows your students. But you're not the only person who handles the grades. Many people that you don't know are looking at those grades, and they're making decisions based on those grades. One example is institutes of further education. Another is the government itself, the authorities. They're looking at numbers. They don't know the names of your students. They don't know who they are. They're not interested in that. That's not their job. But they are interested in the numbers. And if those numbers lie, we are sending out information that is erroneous. And therefore, we can't expect much about the quality of their decisions that they're taking based on that data. We have to make sure that those numbers reflect the truth as far as we can. And I think in many cases, 8 is something we do to avoid sometimes the truth. So I think we should be assigning values that are reflecting reality as much as possible. Now, I'm sure in your case, and my case definitely, students having seen the grade, which is obviously the only thing they're interested in anyway, they come up and say, why? Why did you give me this grade? And often we have to get involved in a discussion or a description or explanation of why, when we don't really want to. Therefore, I think we should put a comment, especially on the written work, remember, we should have a comment which, in a sense, explains the grade. A comment should be brief and balanced. It should mention the positive and mention the negative, briefly. And what it does is show the student why it was a 9 and not a 10, because there was something that had to be improved, and why it was a 9 and not a 7 or an 8, because it had this value, this quality. So briefly we say, well done with the spelling and punctuation. How about be careful with the verb tenses? Something as brief and precise and clear as that explains the grade perfectly. And we probably reduce the number of questions, why did I get that grade, considerably. And it's very clear for the student what they have to improve and what they have to maintain. So when we're responding to the written mistakes, I suggest strongly we always use marking symbols to guide them toward what is wrong, but ask them to correct. We should assign a grade that is realistic, fair, and we should add a comment which explains the grade and helps the student by clarifying their situation with this particular piece of work. Now, supposing it's the oral mistakes when they're speaking, how do we respond to that? Well, we have to decide here whether the activities we're considering are those for promoting fluency or those for promoting accuracy. When it's fluency, we can correct the mistakes before the activity or after the activity. That might sound a bit strange. But we know our students, we know the levels. We can predict easily what type of language they're going to produce mistakes with during certain activities. Let's suppose, for example, you want to set up a fluency activity, a debate in the classroom. Imagine it's a primary classroom, elementary level. We're going to divide the whole group into 2, and we're going to say to this group, I want you to defend the idea that cats are the best pets for children. And the other group, we say, I want you guys to defend the idea that dogs are the best pets for children. So they work together preparing their positions. And then they start debating. And they're trying to convince each other at their level which is the best animal for a pet for children. Now, we can predict quite easily that they're going to have to use the comparative structures. Dogs are more intelligent than, cats are more interesting than, etc. So we can predict that when they're trying to debate and express their ideas, they're going to have challenges where they need to compare the two animals. So before the debate, before we set it up, we do an activity on accuracy when using comparative structures. That is the before method. After, obviously, we make a note of what mistakes they're making during the debate. We don't interrupt. Remember, it's fluency, not accuracy, we're concerned with here. We make a few notes about what mistakes occurred, and then after the debate, after congratulating them on a job well done, we then do an activity to focus on accuracy for that particular structure. So, that's when. It depends on fluency or accuracy. Now, responding to the oral mistakes, the question arises, how? There are many things that teachers do. Remember, I'm not considering here that the teacher corrects or even says the correct form and asks the students to repeat. That's not really what I'm after here. I'm after for something a little bit more challenging, a bit more effective often. Here, all the teacher has to do is to repeat the mistake itself with rising intonation and accompany it by a hand gesture. The hand gesture I'm suggesting is this, which indicates fairly universally something is not quite right. Coupled with the rising intonation on the actual mistake sends a very clear message. There's something wrong and that's what's wrong. I'll give you an example. If a student says, yesterday I go to the cinema, and you want a correction to occur, because this is a fairly frequent mistake in your class. Okay, so you decide to correct it immediately. You want accuracy here. So the student says, yesterday I go to the cinema. I would say, go, and with a facial gesture, a hand movement, and repetition with rising intonation of the precise mistake, I'm sending a very clear message. That's wrong, think about it, and self-correct. Now, it's very important just to repeat the actual mistake, not the whole thing, because then that would be very confusing. If a student says to me, yesterday I go to the cinema, and I say, yesterday you go to the cinema, the student will say, yes, I did. I go to the cinema, not the theatre. We're sending a wrong message. We have to only repeat the incorrect language with the rising intonation, which suggests something about it that's not right, and accompany it with a hand gesture, a facial gesture to make it even clearer. And then we can help the student to correct. Okay, that's the how that I'm suggesting. Very effective, very simple, works very well. Now we come to the who. Might seem strange, the who. Who should correct? Well, there are three possibilities, aren't there, in a classroom? We have the students themselves who make the mistakes. If they correct, it's called self-correction, obviously. We have peer correction, which means a classmate can correct another classmate. And we have teacher correction, which is probably the most common type of corrective method in the world. I want to look at these. But before I do that, I want to focus on something that's very important. It's the issue of nests and nests. Now, I'm English. I'm from England. I've been in Mexico over half my life, but I can't get rid of the Englishness. I don't want to. But I've fortunately had the opportunity to absorb other characteristics from other cultures, which is very pleasant, very meaningful. However, I'm a dying species. I'm a member of a dying species, put it that way. The number of native English teachers who are native speakers of English, is diminishing every decade worldwide. However, the number of non-native English-speaking teachers, nests, non-native English-speaking teachers, is rising every decade considerably. It's a very big business, very big industry, if you like. There are hundreds of thousands of English teachers. But the number of the native people, native speakers of English, the native English-speaking teachers, is reducing every year, almost. And the number of foreign people whose native language is not English, but who have learned English to a very high level and got trained and are now teaching it, those numbers are increasing. Now, some might say, good. I say good. It's interesting. I think the non-native English-speaking teachers have considerable advantages over people like me. Just to mention a couple, you guys, if you are non-native English-speaking teachers, you have been through the process of learning English as a second language. You've studied tenses and passive voice and conditionals. I've never done that. I've never been in a classroom where we were taught that, where I was taught that. I just know it through acquisition. I can't empathize, I can't even sympathize as a native English-speaking teacher of English with students who make mistakes in those areas. I mean, why? Why are you making a mistake? It's so obvious. It's, did you go, not did you went? I mean, what's the problem? It's difficult for us to empathize because we've never been through it. We've never understood what it's like to study it. You guys can. You've done that. You can empathize with them and help them much more than maybe we can sometimes. Another example is you're a role model. In this particular context, I'm no role model. Nobody who's studying English in classrooms will ever get to my level of competence. It's not possible by the study. But you are a role model. You have studied English many, many years. You've got to a very high level, and you're actually teaching it now. That's fantastic. And they can see you as a role model. They can see, oh, she's done that, he's done that. That motivates me to try and reach the same levels. And they know they can't do that with me, so there's no motivational force there for them. But with you guys, there is. Just two advantages. However, there are a couple of differences which might be seen as negatives, which are very important. In our cases, the native English-speaking teachers of English, we know something is wrong when we hear it or read it. We know it's wrong. If we're not trained as a language teacher, we don't know maybe why it's wrong, but we know it's wrong. That's not the way it's expressed in English. Being a trained English teacher, we can also identify why it's wrong very quickly. And sometimes non-native English-speaking teachers are not sure whether that grammar or that pronunciation is the right way or not. We have that advantage, maybe. And secondly, with pronunciation, we do pronounce correctly, despite the variety of accents that exist amongst native English-speaking teachers of English. Our pronunciation, our articulation of the phonemes is correct. And sometimes non-natives come across a combination of sounds that sort of make them struggle a bit in the expression of them, the correct expression of them. So those are the two main advantages, to put it like that, we have over you guys. You have many more advantages than us. Why am I mentioning this? Well, studies that have been done over several decades show clearly that non-native English-speaking teachers of English focus much more on accuracy, on mistakes, than we tend to do. We tend to focus more on communicative success. Whether I understood what the student meant. Despite the mistakes, it's clear what she means. That would get a high grade. Whereas, for example, in some countries, Japan is one of the countries mentioned in these surveys, these researches. The findings are that those people from Japan who teach English focus much more on accuracy. They will castigate or punish a piece of work or a piece of speaking if there are many mistakes, even though it was clearly understandable. They focus on that. They're not the only nationality that do that. Most non-native English-speaking teachers focus on accuracy. Therefore, they assign values according to how much is wrong, grammatically or lexically or whatever. Whereas we tend to think, there are many mistakes, it doesn't matter. I understand very well what she means. That's going to be a high grade. And I'll help her with the mistakes. That's a very important difference there. And that takes us to the other thing here, isn't it? there are there are three people who can correct mistakes. The student himself, a colleague, classmate, or the teacher. They have different effects. They have different levels of efficiency or effectiveness. Let's look at them individually and think about the pros and cons. Self-correction. The student realizes there's something wrong and corrects well. That's self-correction at its best. But there's an issue here that's very important, which is called the wait time. We want the students to self-correct. Generally speaking, it's understood that it's the best way for students to improve. They remember their own mistakes and they remember the feeling of correcting well, and it feels good. It helps you overcome any mistakes you might have in that area. But how long do we wait for a student to do that? How long do we give them to think about it before we have to sort of get involved actively? We can't wait more than 2 or 3 seconds. If we wait much longer than that, it becomes a bit stressful. There's a silence in the room and you're waiting for the student to sort of correct. That's not quite right, is it? And we can't sort of wait just 1 second. That doesn't give them enough time to think. So generally speaking, we should wait maybe 3 seconds. And if we realize the student hasn't quite found the correct form, we would do something to help. But we give them the opportunity. So self-correction, when done well, is considered, and I consider it myself, the best way for students to go in this issue. However, we must be careful about how long we wait for them, not too little a time and not too long a time, before we interfere, so to speak, to help. The second possibility is peer correction. Here we have a contrast, if you like. Depends on who the peer is, doesn't it? Who the other student is, who's correcting me. If I get along with that student and it's a friend of mine and I have respect for that person, then if they correct me, it's probably quite memorable and quite helpful. But if it's someone in the group I don't actually like, or someone who has a tendency to mock and sort of corrects his peers in a mocking tone, then we don't want that to happen. As teachers, we don't want it to happen. It's not the right atmosphere. We want collaboration. If collaboration works and collaboratively they help each other through peer correction, it's fantastic. It's memorable. It helps. But we have to avoid the risks of those who mock sometimes, or the person trying to correct also gets it wrong. That can happen. Then we have 2 mistakes to handle there. So it's probably the second best way if it works. If it doesn't work, we have to work out what's going wrong and try to fix that, because it is a good thing to happen. And then finally, we have teacher correction, which I think in terms of how many times students are corrected by whom, this is obviously the most common. Most commonly, teachers correct students. Unfortunately, it's the least effective. Teachers and students have the idea that teachers should correct. That's what they do. They correct students. So it's not memorable. It's sort of automatic. And we don't want students to get in the idea that, okay, I'll make a mistake, my teacher will correct it, yeah. No, that's not right. So yes, we do need to correct sometimes when the other 2 methods don't work, but we should be very careful about overusing teacher correction in the classroom. Our job is not to correct really so much as to guide the students towards self-correction. And anyway, as a final point here, whoever corrects, peer or teacher, the student must self-correct. That's very important. The student must self-correct whoever else corrects. So the peer corrects and the student says, oh yes, and then says it correctly himself or herself. If the teacher corrects, the student must immediately repeat the correct form. Without self-correction occurring at all, we're not going to achieve so much. Now, a discussion here is very interesting. Yogi Berra, I don't know if you know, not being a fan of baseball, I don't really know, but he apparently was a very famous baseball player in the States, US. And he was noted for his ability as a baseball player, but also for his wit and his ability to produce some very interesting comments about life, about baseball, but metaphorically about life, which makes you think when you read them. And he once said they lost a match because they made too many wrong mistakes. Now, reading that, you think, what do you mean by wrong mistakes? All mistakes are wrong. Well, actually, they're not. So here, to terminate today's webinar, we're going to just quickly analyze the differences between the wrong mistake and the right mistake. The wrong mistake. When can a mistake, apart from being a mistake, be the wrong mistake? And when can a mistake, apart from being a mistake, be the right mistake to make? You're probably sounding out and have come to some sort of approximation of what the ideas are here. Actually, they're quite clear. We can make the wrong mistake or we can make the right mistake. Every mistake can be categorized as the wrong or the right mistake to make, apart from being mistakes. That's the irony. The wrong mistake is when you don't learn from that mistake. And as well as that, or apart from that, it's not really your mistake. You made the mistake through pressure, maybe, or someone else's interference. Someone else sort of suggested, and you just repeated what they said, and you made a mistake. It wasn't your mistake. It was their mistake. If that's the case, it's the wrong mistake to make. Couple that with the idea, as I just mentioned, that if you don't learn from a mistake, if the mistake doesn't give you an opportunity to learn, then it's not a mistake worth making. It has no real value. It's just wrong and then dead. But a mistake that gives you the opportunity to think and to correct and to improve, those mistakes are the mistakes that we want our students to make, the right mistakes. The wrong mistakes, no. The mistakes that don't give us opportunities to improve, the mistakes that are not really ours, are the wrong mistakes to make. Put that into the context of the classroom. Then the right mistakes, the mistakes we want our students to make, we actually want them to make those mistakes because mistakes are indicators of learning. The right mistakes are the indicators of learning. We want our students to learn. How do we know they're learning? If a student doesn't make a mistake ever in your class, whether they're writing or speaking, they never make a mistake. Then with you, they're not learning. They've learned before. But with you and your classes, they're not learning. There's no learning process, there's no improvement going on. We don't want that. And if they make mistakes all the time, every time they speak and write is wrong, we don't want that either, because we know that would be negative. So what do we want? We want the right mistakes at the right frequency, the right mistakes at the right number. And the right mistakes are clearly those that the student makes themselves, not through interference or influence from other things or other people, and the mistakes that give them the opportunity to reflect and improve. Those are the mistakes we want. For many teachers, changing this switch is quite difficult. Many teachers consider mistakes, whatever, wrong. They shouldn't be made. We want a class where no mistakes are ever made. Well, as I said, think about that. That's not the best way. That's not the best case for us and for our students. So, I do hope all this today has given you a clearer perspective on what is one of the most important issues, one of our most important responsibilities, which is handling the incorrect language produced in our classes. I hope to see you next time. Thank you very much.